terms of Israel and Hezbollah, it ends when there's a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, this is a byproduct of the war in Gaza. Hezbollah is Hamas's ally. Hezbollah say they will carry on fighting and sending rockets into Israel so long as there is war in Gaza. Um, in the long term, that's a very good question. You know, Israel is surrounded by enemies, and you know, it's not making a lot of effort to make friends with those enemies, even if they could be made friends with. Hezbollah and Hamas are currently dedicated to Israel's destruction. Hamas have suggested there could be long-term ceasefires and some sort of mutual acceptance in return for a Palestinian state. Um, Hezbollah might go along with that, but whether that's a long-term um, answer to the issue, even supposing Israel were, you know, to agree to a Palestinian state, is another matter.
Residents in southern Lebanon woke up yesterday to this. That is Israeli fighter jets taking out hundreds of Hezbollah missile launchers on Sunday morning. There's similar footage from northern Israel too, showing rockets being intercepted. It is the biggest exchange, we think, between Israel and Hezbollah since 2006. Hezbollah say they were firing rockets and drones at Israel in retaliation for the assassination of a senior commander. Richard Spencer is the Times correspondent who's been covering events in the Middle East since October, and he joins us now. Richard, will you just remind us of what's happened over the weekend? Because it seems today relative calm in comparison to yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that this was a pretty calibrated effort on both sides. I mean, it's not quite clear how this exchange came about in the way it did. It was a very intensive barrage on both sides, as you saw. Israel say that they had intelligence of a major Hezbollah attack and intercepted it, preempted it with this massive sort of air attack on Hezbollah missile launchers early in the morning. Hezbollah, of course, say that they did get quite a lot of their rockets off and were aiming at basically Mossad headquarters at an army base in the north of Tel Aviv, just to the north of Tel Aviv, that hosts the Mossad headquarters and various other intelligence units. Israel says that wasn't hit at all. This is all a response to the killing of Fuad Shukr, who was the Hezbollah military commander in. He was hit by a strike in an airstrike in Beirut at the end of July. Hezbollah has been saying it has to retaliate, it has to respond to that assassination. This was what this was all about, said Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, yesterday. But he also said, well, that was it. And you know, one sailor in Israel died. A handful of Hezbollah operatives were killed in the response. So it's kind of quite hard to unpick, if you like. Really heavy firepower, but not a lot of deaths by the standards of this war, and not a lot of consequences. Both sides indicated pretty immediately that that was it for now.
Have both sides managed to save face?
That's a very good question. You know, this was certainly about saving face for Hezbollah in terms of responding to the, you know, this extraordinary attack in July. I mean, some of these Israeli attacks are quite extraordinary. He was hit, the apartment block he was in was hit by, you know, spot on, pinpoint accuracy and all that by an Israeli strike late in the afternoon of a, you know, ordinary day in late July. He was killed instantly. That's pretty humiliating for Hezbollah. That you know the Israelis should have known exactly where he was in that way. Hezbollah claimed to have had their retaliation by this massive attack yesterday. They don't seem to have had much of an effect, at least according to the Israelis. And of course, you know, the Israelis could be lying about the extent of the damage. They say not a single one of their military bases was hit or damaged, which doesn't look great for Hezbollah in terms of its the way it sells itself to its people. But it is able to say it did something. So And of course, it has huge firepower in reserve. It doesn't want to get involved in a full scale war with Israel at this point and risk its major missile arsenal, which it still has.
The question is, Richard, and it's impossible to answer this briefly, how does this end?
Um, well, the short answer is pretty easy. In terms of Israel and Hezbollah, it ends when there's a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, this is a byproduct of the war in Gaza. Hezbollah is Hamas's ally. Hezbollah say they will carry on fighting and sending rockets into Israel so long as there is war in Gaza. In the long term, that's a very good question. You know, Israel is surrounded by enemies, and you know, it's not making a lot of effort to make friends with those enemies, even if they could be made friends with. Hezbollah and Hamas are currently dedicated to Israel's destruction. Hamas have suggested there could be long-term ceasefires and some sort of mutual acceptance in return for a Palestinian state. Um, Hezbollah might go along with that, but whether that's a long-term answer to the issue, even supposing Israel were, you know, to agree to a Palestinian state, is another matter. Israel fears it wouldn't be. You know, there's certainly not going to be any love lost between these two sides for the coming decades.
Well, we're going to find out more now and speak to the IDF. Richard, thank you. Richard Spencer, the Times correspondent. Well, listening to that is Nadav Shoshani, IDF spokesperson. Thank you very much for your time. You presumably want this conflict to end. And we've just heard the analysis from Richard Spencer there saying that what would end that would be a ceasefire in Gaza. Why is that taking so long?
Well, negotiations is a complicated thing, but for us, the goals of the war are very clear. The goals of the war are to bring back the hostages and to dismantle the terrorist organization Hamas. Hamas. Right now, I'm in outskirts of Gaza in an Israeli community, and the distance between the houses of the Israeli communities and Gaza is a few hundred meters. And what we learned on October 7th, we cannot accept the existence of a terror organization that wants to destroy and murder Israelis just a few hundred meters from our borders. Something for a lot of people around the world, it's hard to imagine how close this terror threat is. It's not one or two, it's a terror army that is located a few hundred meters from our communities. And there's two ways for this war to end. One, or to have, at least have a ceasefire, is Hamas could have a ceasefire and Gaza could have a ceasefire today. If they return the hostages and put down their weapons, we would have, the war would be over right this instance. It's a very simple war. Hamas started this war. Hamas could end this war, and we are acting to defend our people, to prevent this terror threat from ever happening again,
Yeah, we
and
know
to bring
though
home
that
our hostages.
you talk about territory, and it's 40,000 people who've died so far in this conflict, the majority of them being civilians. So the appetite to fix this presumably is high. Let's just discuss what happened over the weekend, because we've been hearing from Hezbollah, who said that the first phase of retaliation, they said, were concluded for the day. If we are satisfied with how the enemy responds, we will consider our response complete. Is the IDF's response complete?
Well, the IDF is acting to protect our people. The IDF has no business in wars. We're called the Israel Defense Force, and that's how it's been in the last 10 months. Hezbollah started a war unprovoked for no reason on October 8th, just because they're part of this terror axis, run by Iran, funded by Iran, backed by Iran. And we have been defending our people and striking back in the last 10 months. And that's what we did yesterday. Our strike was against rocket launchers directed at Israeli civilians, at northern Israel mostly. And our strike was to prevent an immediate terror attack against Israeli civilians, innocent civilians. And that's what we did. And if a terror attack or a terror threat keeps coming, and the terror threat in the north of Israel is still imminent on Israeli civilians. As we're speaking, there's over 60,000 Israelis that have been evacuated from their homes and can't go home because of this threat of a terror organization a few hundred meters from their homes.
But ultimately, Hezbollah will say that they were responding to the fact that you had assassinated one of their senior commanders. You knew this retaliation was going to come if you pursued action like that.
Well, if we want to go back and put it in context, that we should do it all the way. This war started on October 8th by Hezbollah, unprovoked by any reason. The general that we eliminated was eliminated because he had the blood of hundreds of people on his hands, including hundreds of Americans and French. He has had many terror attacks on his hands. The most recent one was killing children in Matzah Shams in a soccer field on a Saturday evening a few weeks ago. You probably remember the incident. So if you want to go back, we can keep going back and back and back. But the point of the matter is Hezbollah is a terror organization backed by Iran, and their goal is to destabilize the region and to destroy the state of Israel. And we are acting in self-defense to remove immediate threats on Israeli civilians.
Both sides have said you are ready for war, but you do not want to go to war. Is that true of the IDF?
We've said it numerous times, and I've said it in this interview. We are the Israel Defense Forces. We're not looking for war. We're acting in self-defense to remove threats against our civilians. We are acting to push back Hezbollah. Hezbollah is violating an international agreement agreed on by all the countries in the UN and agreed on by the country of Lebanon for them to be north of the Litani. And they are clearly in the south of Lebanon, on the verge of our borders, threatening civilians, innocent civilians who had to evacuate from their homes. And we are fighting to push them back and to bring life back to normality where people can go back to their homes in northern Israel.
You are risking escalation every time you take action. Diplomats and analysts have warned repeated any sort of miscalculation could lead to an uncontrollable escalation. To what extent are you bearing that in mind in every step of course of action that you take?
Well, I would argue that Hezbollah is threatening the region in an escalation. Hezbollah has been threatening for weeks to act against us.
But in
And
terms of Israel's actions?
And yesterday when we're acting to prevent a wider escalation. We were acting to prevent a larger attack against Israel. We weren't acting to attack. We were acting to prevent a larger attack, trying to prevent this escalation, trying to prevent civilians getting hurt. Because as we said in the past, we will not accept our civilians being killed and being hurt by Hezbollah rocket fire. And we were preventing that because that thing would lead to an escalation.
Nadav Shoshani, thank you very much for your time. IDF spokesperson speaking to me this morning after what we saw yesterday, Israel and Hezbollah firing hundreds of missiles in what has been the largest exchange of war since 2006.